Thank you, everyone, for attending our event. Elections in Georgia between Europe and Russia. Russia is still not decisively settled yet, and I'm sure we'll have lots of different viewpoints today on present scenarios and future scenarios as well. I'm Justin Hideo. I'm the professor of the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in the Department of Political Science at Carleton University. So I've worked on Georgia for the last few years, working primarily actually on rivers and society in Georgia, but I want to introduce this event as the first event of the Eastern European and Transatlantic Network, sponsored by the Department of National Defense through their Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program. And this will be one of a series of events, podcasts, and outputs that we'll have that will be looking at security and defense issues in the region more broadly, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and the Arctic. So if you just Google us at ETN, you'll be able to find us, or through the Bureau's website at Carleton. Today, we'll be looking at the elections in Georgia, as I said, and I think what I'll do is I'll introduce all of our speakers now, and then we'll just go in roundtable format through the panel. Yes. So Cornelia Kakachia is a professor of political science and John William Chair at Ivana Zakashvili, Tbilisi State University in Georgia. He's also director of the Tbilisi-based think tank Georgian politics, and his current research focuses on Georgian domestic and foreign policy and security issues of the wider Black Sea area and comparative party politics. He's won several fellowships. Has a very impressive publication background with them. Co-editor of the book titled Georgian Foreign Policy in the 20th Century, Challenges for State, and he's appeared on the BBC, Deutsche Welle, Financial Times, and other major outlets. Our second speaker will be David Sichanova, who's a human geographer and an adjunct research professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here in Ottawa. His research focuses on elections and public opinion. Then Nino Antadze is associate professor of environmental studies at the University of Prince Island. Her research focuses on environmental justice, energy poverty, and sustainability transitions. Currently, she examines lived experience of energy poverty in Georgia during the prolonged energy crisis of the 1990s. Previously, she studied local opposition to large hydropower projects in Georgia. Anna Rekyashvili, MA in Gender Studies from Central European University in Budapest, PhD at Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies from New York University, experience in academic and policy research, working on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. She's also a director of a community center in Georgia, working to create safe spaces for LGBTQ people to meet, and has reached out with other universities, such as other institutions, such as universities, to give a better understanding of LGBT issues. So having had this introduction, so I'll ask all of our speakers to just talk for about 5 to 7 minutes, outline some major themes, and it'll give us a good chance for questions and answers, and we'll end at about 11:25, 11:30, because our class coming at 11:30. So if Cornelia is ready to go, Cornelia, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation and to give me option to talk with this kind of audience. As you know, this election in Georgia was very crucial for many reasons, because of one of the reasons is, of course, ongoing war in Ukraine, and this there's also this West opposition of the West and with Russia, and then there's also many things going on in terms of geopolitics in the region, and of course many Georgians, they were waiting for outcome of this election because of several reasons. Because as you know, Georgia was given candidate status just last year, and it was considered like a big breakthrough in terms of European integration of Georgia. And actually, nobody could believe that, for instance, if you had asked me a few years ago that Georgia will be in such situation where we stand now, where basically we may have a political crisis because of this election. First of all, maybe why this election was important. First of all, opposition as well as government actually coined this election as a choice between Europe and opposition coined it between Europe and Russia, while government actually tried to portray this election as a choice between war and peace. And of course, for political scientists or other studies of civil society, they were adding a little bit more different angle, basically that there is a choice also between authoritarianism and democracy. And I think what we saw that in this election, that of course we had I would say, Georgia had a very critical or bad elections last 32 years since independence. But this one was, I think, the probably worst one, where you had basically, all kind of intimidations, vote buying, and some other, according to different international and local observers. And I think that puts Georgia in very shaky position, because this is the first time when ordinary Georgians actually, they fear that they may lose their homeland. This is the same kind of feeling like probably Belarusians or Azeri civil society representatives had. And of course, we had many strange government in Georgia, some of them authoritarian, some of them nationalists, some others, but we never had that kind of feeling. And I think this is important also in many ways, because especially if you remember, the Georgian public is supporting, the public support for Georgia's European integration is very high. And last year we saw the young people who are normally not so much politically active, they took the streets, and they were the actually drivers of this, of these manifestations. And this is what I would call the Erasmus generation, who actually embrace the liberal values and democracy. And for them, it's impossible to live in such country like what the Georgian Dream, the ruling party, actually is offering to Georgia. And I think we also have very interesting situation, because this is first time when Georgian Dream, which claims the victory here, is isolated. And we see that only few countries, mostly illiberal countries like Azerbaijan, or Hungary, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and some other, this kind of country, and only exception was Armenia, they congratulated to the government. And I think while Western partners, especially European Union and United States, actually they gave very critical statement. So I think this puts Georgia's position really this puts Georgia in volatile situation, because for the government actually, which is already under the isolation, if there will be some sort of doubt about this election, and this is what we see now, there's a call from EU and the United States that there should be probe, and some even call that there should be special commission actually who will investigate these irregularities. And of course, the people, especially ordinary Georgians, are very angry. And I think we don't even know how things will go, because we may have another major crisis here. And this is exactly the time. What matters now is the time, because if international community and local civil society in opposition will not bring this issue as soon as possible, it may be overshadowed by U.S. election. As you know, there's also this kind of fear in Georgia. In terms of geopolitics, also what we see is that with this kind of election, we already know that this is a halt of the European integration of Georgia, and we already had very critical statement, and today European Union will release, it's important, report which actually will assess Georgia's European integration. And we already know that this will not be probably positive, but at the same time, we have here the quite strange situation when there's a public pressure where public actually wants to join European Union, and then you have a basically oligarch and his ruling party who actually trying to kind of stop the country to move forward towards European integration. Maybe I'll stop here, and I will be more than happy to discuss this and other issues during the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thank you. David.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, I think, and Lisa. It's everybody for coming together. I will try to focus on more two specific issues. These are the actual voting results, and I would like to discuss that in the geographic lens, and through the geographic lens and like socioeconomic lens, let's say so. Of course, there is a whole discussion whether actually votes were cast correctly, and voting actually reflected the will of the people. But right now, of course, voting also could show not only the patterns of what people were voting for in different places, but also how votes could be manipulated in different places. And with the voting manipulation, I mean diverse things that could be ballot stuffing, or could be voter intimidation, or voting like so-called block vote, right? I'm going to discuss those things a little bit later. First of all, quickly about the turnout, we saw that these elections were very similar to the presidential election, to the second round of the 2018 presidential elections. Both saw quite high election turnout. Actually, these elections had the almost second largest turnout compared to almost all elections held after the Georgia's independence, especially after the 21st century. So the 2012 elections, which saw the government change, was at the highest turnout, and this turnout was actually the second largest, I would say. And which means that almost like 2 million people showed up, which actually is quite a large number for a small country like Georgia, which has 2.9 adults residing in Georgia. If we look at the turnout in terms of, and these elections also saw the mobilization especially in urban areas. In urban areas where, interestingly, the supporters of the kind of more liberal opposition were, and we saw that in these areas, Georgian Dream actually lost elections, especially in the capital city and the large city just outside of the capital. But an important thing is that the turnout actually worked in both ways. So, of course, it helped the opposition to garner, in general, more votes than the Georgian Dream. But it also helped the Georgian Dream to mobilize its support, because Georgian Dream was able to mobilize its own supporters outside of the capital city, in the provinces. So therefore, since Georgia has proportional representation with 5% threshold, overall, like any vote, and it, unlike Canada, it doesn't have the ridings. Any vote gained actually goes into your piggy bank, right? And therefore, any votes that they gained nationwide were actually helpful, very helpful for the Georgian Dream. When it comes to the, so I mentioned that these elections were very similar to the runoff of presidential elections of 2018, and we see that there were in most of the electoral districts vote gains. Turnout was very similar to to the 2024 elections, meaning that in almost all districts, in many of the country's districts, I would say about like 30 out of 65 or 67 districts that are existing in the country, most probably showed up in elections. With regards to vote cast, I think the geographic length is very important. Socio and some kind of socioeconomic lens as well. We see, and there are many accusations circulating in social media and then just in media in general. We saw that there was a clear distinction in terms of settlement type. Rural voters were more likely to vote for the Georgian Dream. Actually, Georgian Dream garnered about 65 of total votes cast in rural areas. Tbilisi, the capital city, there the Georgian Dream lost. Actually, they got 42%, while the liberal opposition got 46% there. While in the urban areas in between Tbilisi and rural areas, we clearly see that Georgian Dream was more successful, but the threshold was smaller. So it was 53% for the GD and 39% for the opposition. And Georgia has large diaspora. I also voted as a diaspora member here in Georgian embassy, and diaspora also overwhelmingly voted against the Georgian Dream. So it was about 73% for the opposition versus 18%. We can also, besides urban-rural dimension, we also should mention the ethno-national dimension. Georgia has national minorities who live in two specific regions of Georgia. This is Karamokartli and Samtskhe-Javakheti. These are Azerbaijani and Armenian minorities. And unfortunately, all the ruling parties, communists, the United National Movement, Shevardnadze's political party, they would always use local elites and the votes of national minorities to keep themselves in the power. And we see that in these electoral districts, Georgian Dream was able to get about 85 or 90% of votes cast. Critics argue that perhaps Georgian Dream is representing the views of national minorities, but looking at their policies, of course, that's not the case. And usually that's multiple issues that come up here, including the foreign interference that we can discuss a little bit. And finally, socioeconomic dimension that I wanted to say. If you look at them, if you divide polling precincts by relative wealth index, so there is a special index that can be calculated. It's based on the Facebook data. You can see that among 300 most wealthiest polling precincts across the country, opposition was successful, and there was about like 45% of votes going to the opposition. However, if you look at the poorest 300, close to 300 polling precincts, those precincts were voting overwhelmingly for the Georgian Dream, for the government. So it's about 66% votes cast in such precincts for the Georgian Dream. So therefore, we can see that there is and of course, this is actually quite a linear trend. So poorer the place, more votes were cast for the Georgian Dream. Again, critics would say that, okay, Georgian Dream is representing the views of poor people. But on the other hand, you can see that the number of people who receive social assistance has increased over time, despite the fact that Georgia's economic growth actually have been quite formidable. So we can there are like many unknowns in this process, and many things could be alleged. I think I can expand on the irregularities in voting later on, and yeah, Boris, to other members of the panel.
I think I will just say how I see the current process, because it's so unpredictable and dynamic, and probably there are now some statements were made today morning that we've missed and we don't know yet. And so it is changing every hour. But see this as kind of two processes. One is an attempt to legitimize the power of the ruling party, and the other process is to delegitimize that. On the first, in terms of the first process, that was elections, and in normal countries, that's how power is legitimized. You have elections, and then whoever is elected, that's they have the right to rule. However, in this case, we see such a massive scale of election fraud that is, of course, questioned. However, for the Georgian dream, that would be an important milestone for making further steps in whatever agenda they have, because they are elected by the majority. Next day after the elections, you may remember Hungary's Viktor Orban visited Georgia. That's another attempt to legitimize the outcome of the elections. And then all the statements that they make and what they try to do. On the other hand, we have an attempt to prove that these are not legitimate elections and legitimize the ruling party and the outcome of the elections. So on this end, we have united, I would call it the united front created by the president and all opposition parties. And in terms of the second process, I would probably highlight two types of the legitimization. One is moral and one is political or legal. In terms of moral, I think Georgian Dream Party has already been morally corrupt, morally bankrupt, because their actions and policies, especially for the last 2 years after the start of the war in Ukraine, are in conflict with the values held by the majority of the Georgian society. And this is mostly about Europe, about Ukraine, and generally who is the friend and who is the foe. So morally, that distinction, that conflict, that dissent has been very apparent in the last year, I would say, started from the first attempt of introducing this Russian copy of the Russian foreign agent law, which was last year. Now, that's a moral side of things. In terms of the legal or political, these are all this the work that's going on to gather the evidence about fraud, manipulation, suppression, all sort of things that have been happening before the elections and during the day of the elections. What happens next? I don't know. I think it's difficult to say that. I think I agree with the speakers here that we are in a political crisis, and this crisis might deepen. The other question is that in this situation, how you can rule the country in which there is so much dissent, and so there's so much questioning of your legitimacy, both inside the country and outside the country, and external factor is very important here, because nobody, from Western democracies, nobody has approved the results of this election or accepted the results of the election so far. Quite the contrary, we have a very strict statements from everywhere. So how this is going to play out in a longer or medium term, it's unclear. So I think that's all I guess I have to say now.
Okay. Thank you, Anna.
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to listen to everybody. For my comments today, I thought to focus on the potentialities of what it means for Georgia to have a government aligned with Russian, but also other authoritarian regimes that have been kind of sprouting all over the world. The reason is that very often, even in Georgia and also outside, when we talk about what's been happening in Georgia, we mostly focus on the geopolitical aspects of it, meaning that we talk about how the recent politics of the Georgian Dream Party and pre-election politics have really aligned with kind of Russian-style authoritarianism. And I think it's like worth it to investigate like what that actually could mean for Georgian people in a longer term, since also the results of the elections were what they were. And I actually changed the focus of my talk to this after the results because I was so disheartened by them. Where I could bring my perspective or my expertise to this conversation is through my dissertation research, I thought, because my research looked at the impacts of the anti-gender, authoritarian, right-wing regime, political regime on mostly feminist movement in Hungary, but also at all sorts of like politically progressive movements. And when I did my research in 2020, Orban's Fidesz party, which is the right-wing government of Hungary, had been in power for like around 15 years, at that time it was more than 10 years. So the regime had been very established. So I kind of wanted to highlight some of the results that this kind of regime had on the social and like social aspects of living in Hungary, as well as kind of lived realities of different actors. And towards the end, I want to talk a little bit about like how Georgia compares to Hungary, because it's not identical, but I wouldn't say it's better. When I talk about this kind of like when I mention a lot the anti-gender discourse that has been kind of one of the primary focuses of the Georgian government pre-election. They had like kind of two electoral perspectives, and one was saying no to the war, whatever that meant, and the second one was the anti-gender, like taking up the anti-gender discourse that has been popular in the region, in Russia, in Hungary, in many other places actually recently. So I want to briefly also discuss what I mean with that. When I speak about anti-gender discourse, I do mean this kind of attack on the concept of gender itself by different right-wing actors saying that, oh, like the concept of gender challenges the fabric of our societies because it kind of like dissolves the idea of dual sexes, et cetera, et cetera. But on top of that, what this discourse does in the right-wing movement is that it also attacks any sort of socially progressive politics by placing them as part of the vague, based on the context of this like vague Western or international or liberal politics. So you get like different concepts like socially progressive politics become like a liberal conspiracy, or it's like a liberalism gone too far, or it's political correctness gone too far. And what that also does is that it places right-wing actors as this kind of pseudo anti-colonial speakers who are opposing the colonization from the Western values or from the liberal values, like really depending on the context. So in Georgia, it's usually like against Europe, but within Europe, it's against the global liberal dominance, right? So it's this kind of like the anti-colonial absolutely pseudo anti-colonial discourse, because these are the people in power who speak of themselves as if they have been marginalized by some sort of like liberal voice, right? But it becomes very important to like appealing to public, but also like kind of, how do I say that? Capitalizing on a lot of discontents of living in the neoliberal world, essentially. But it is what I want to highlight is what happens when this discourse becomes official state discourse, which Georgia started because the manifestations of this discourse are the couple of 3 or 4 of the laws that Georgian government very quickly adopted. A law against the so-called foreign agents that kind of manifest this dynamic that I just discussed. The so-called anti-LGBT propaganda law, which originated in Russia in 2012, and they just like really copied it. They also start to regulate the marriage as an institution between men and women a few years ago. So these are the kind of manifestations what we see, but what we don't often see is like how deeply this kind of authoritarian regime really it gets entrenched in the social life. So what I saw had happened in Hungary since 2010 when I did my research was that we saw that the state control had reached to not every aspect of social, political, and economic life of the people. It had reached to academia, it had reached to arts, as in like when I was there in 2020, there were protests because the theaters were getting nationalized and any dissenting directors were being fired. The Academy of Sciences was getting dissolved. And it also, once the state takes up this ideology, instead of having like right-wing groups talking about the right-wing discourse, it also impacts how the funding gets distributed to multiple like research agendas or cultural products and media, et cetera, right? The censorship already, and we're talking about the EU state, right? The censorship at that time was really, really high already. For example, like a couple of academics had been fired from like national, like very reputable universities for mentioning hate speech in their talks. Self-censorship was something that came up a lot, and these are some of the like recognizable impacts of the authoritarianism, right? Increased social hatred, increased hate crimes, increased attacks on politically progressive groups. But what was also very interesting to me was that often this kind of repressive regimes bring up a lot of dissent. So in Georgia, we see this a lot too, like the glamorization of political opposition to a repressive regime. And we believe that like somehow, and I think it's like kind of pop culture influence, that this kind of resistance brings some like radically transformative politics. And don't get me wrong, it does. It's very impressive to see like opposition to authoritarian regimes. But what we saw in Hungary, and we can see that in different eras, like if you look at like, say, feminist movements in fascist Italy, like from the history, we know that when the state becomes this kind of right-wing, almost fascistic, authoritarian regime, the social movements also, even when they oppose the regime, they're less radical. The conversations and the social changes that have been achieved actually like dial back because they're like the issues that are needed to be fought for at that moment kind of dialed back to a couple tens of years. So what we saw in Hungary, for example, was that because of the state hostility towards anything gender-related and feminist-related, the women's movement was really trying to distance itself from like anti-racist, transgender, even queer actors. And they were saying, oh, we need to legitimize ourselves by working with like real women and speak up about the real women's problems, which also means that they would like limit their mandate to, say, like white, ethnically Hungarian straight women of the middle class, right? So I fear that even in Georgia now we seem to be very proud and happy of what is happening in terms of the protests to the government, but I'm really, really afraid of what a long term of this kind of regimes could bring. And I wanted to like kind of highlight that. If I have a couple minutes, I will talk about differences between Georgia and Hungary.
Take 2 minutes, sure.
Sorry?
Just take 2 minutes, yeah.
Okay, 2 minutes is great. So we know that Georgia is not Hungary. And there are like major differences between them. One of the biggest difference that probably stands up for everybody is that Hungary is a EU state, whereas Georgia is not. What that also means that a lot of like laws and regulations that Hungary adopted were taken back by the EU mandated to take them back, whereas Georgia doesn't really have that as a mechanism. What we also need to highlight is that Hungary is politically kind of aligned with Putin's Russia, but it doesn't depend on their goodwill. They're not under the direct threat of Russian occupation. For Georgia, on the other hand, because Russia, and this is a different conversation to have, right? How Russians start this idea of the Russian world that is like traditionalist, and it tries to grab all the kind of countries that it wants to have political influence onto through like enforcing this kind of like Russian style laws and ideologies, etc. Right? For Georgia, it's important to highlight, to maintain this kind of politics in order to show its allegiance with Russia. And in that sense, it compares more to the countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Belarus than Hungary per se, right? In fact, I think it's very important to mention that, say, like adoption of the foreign agents law in Georgia was not like a populist and self-interested move. It did not bring Georgian party any favors, really. But they had to do it. For what reasons? Like, I don't want to manipulate, but it was like almost like really strange that they had to do it before the elections. But I like the two reasons probably are like showing their commitment to pro-Russian politics / like getting more like authoritarian tentacles into everything. And finally, Hungary. Actually, I'll skip to my last piece. Sorry about that. What's very important also for Georgia is that Georgia is very economically tied to EU. And what I focus on in this case is a lot of like social benefits that get distributed to Georgian people through a nonprofit or societal organizations. These organizations, since Georgia is a poor country, have like really have been taken up. A lot of like social, medical, psychological, kind of welfare practices have been taken up by the NGOs in the country because state is not doing them or can't do them, which is sad in itself, but that's the reality. So Georgia derailing from this also means that we will lose a lot of social benefits that we're enjoying right now, which weighs really hard on me because I was always part of that system. So maybe those are some of the major themes I wanted to outline. I'm sorry, it is not very optimistic, and I'll be happy to hear the questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to talk briefly about the security and defense environment in Georgia. So over the last couple of years, especially based on discussions with US officials and Georgian experts who I talked to in Tbilisi last summer, where the mood I think was relatively bleak. And of course, the elections have confirmed that that for now. So just to give a bit of background first, Georgia has a long history of working with NATO and the United States. So Georgia has had troops in Afghanistan since 2004. There was this case, the Bucharest Summit in 2008, where there was a roadmap to Georgian NATO membership. That, of course, was one of the reasons that led to Russia's involvement in the war with Georgia that led to deepening Russian control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia, provinces in Georgian territory. But after that, the US and Georgia set up a Strategic Partnership Commission in 2009. So between these bilateral and multilateral cooperation, you have things like issues of interoperability being worked on, crisis management, defense readiness, cybersecurity. We have something called a Substantial NATO-Georgia Pact, the SNGP, which has been a practical pathway to practical cooperation over the last decade plus. So really, up until I would say up until COVID. So some of the experts that I was talking to in the US military officials said they could sense fractures in the relationship between the West and Russia starting in 2020. And there were various issues beyond Georgian Dream that were leading to this. Part of it was the end of the Afghanistan peacekeeping mission, which led to more distance between Western and Georgian officials, as a degradation in troop readiness among the Georgian soldiers. COVID also was something that led to a certain degree of distance. Then Russia's war in Ukraine happened. So I mean, it was interesting to talk to some of these military officials. There was some sense that yes, this Georgian Dream slogan, as was mentioned earlier on, by Cornely, I think, of saying, pitting this war versus peace dichotomy as made up as it is, had some resonance among the population, and also had some resonance among people who were angry with Mikhail Saakashvili, who some in retrospect see as he was the leader of Georgia, who took Georgia to the war in 2008. It's his party. I mean, they're a different party now than it was then, but it's still the same party that was one of the major opposition parties. So this language was effective, and with some discussion that even if the officers in Georgia tend to be quite pro-Western, the soldiers in the Georgian army tend not necessarily to be pro-Western, and that might probably align to David's discussion about the socioeconomic, the soldiers who tend to be from less well-off areas versus officer corps. So when this pro-Russian turn happened, that we've talked in various scenarios about, by 2024, mid-2024, the Georgian Dream was starting to accuse the United States of planning a coup against it. It seemed to be Vladimir, but we haven't talked about yet, but he was obviously this major Georgian oligarch who is the de facto leader of Georgian Dream, and you could almost talk about a personal state capture, we talked about that in some discussions. This party of war rhetoric is designed to lump the opposition in with Western countries, and somehow the evil figure of George Soros, or anti-Semitism also comes into that. This led on the US side to the cancellation of military exercises, so-called Mobile Partner, and defensive assistance. The US has sanctioned about 30 to 40 Georgians. It hasn't published this list. Prefers to keep it quiet. I don't know how long it will be quiet now that this election is over. And the European Union has suspended partnership negotiations as well as military aid with Georgia. So what happens now? I think the discussion I was having in the summer among US officials is that there's a limited amount of energy that they're willing to put into Georgia. They've invested so much, hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade or so, trying to build Georgian democracy. If it fails, they're not going to keep throwing money at the republic. So we'll see. President Biden just came out last night with a condemnation of the democratic backsliding in Georgia. I've noticed there's still a hesitancy to talk about the nature of irregularities in Georgia. Still a little bit of lack of clarity, which we'll get to, I'm sure, in the discussion. Georgia does have a lack of military capacity. In the military, Georgia has 37,000 soldiers, spends about $500 million a year, US dollars a year on the military, which is the least of any country in the region. Armenia, for example, has been more than double, probably triple that now. As I mentioned, the military officers of pro-Western have very good relationships with the Americans and NATO members, more so than the soldiers. I think that Georgian Dream continues in power. They will most likely just let NATO cooperation wither on the vine. They still claim to be a reliable partner of NATO, and they're aware of strong support for NATO membership among the Georgian population. I'm sure we'll talk about this dichotomy. Was mentioning this way that how Georgian dream is going to rule a population has very different ideas from it. It's not unclear to what extent they would publicize cooperation with Russian intelligence services. So there's lots of rumors, and there's clear indications this is happening, but we're still not sure to what extent it might or will happen. I think among the American observers, they believe that Georgian Dream thinks it's more important to the West than it really is. I think Georgian Dream is considering that they could play a multi-vector game if they wanted to, but the West is not going to be willing to play that game. I think I'm relying on the partner. The United States has moved more already towards Armenia as its major ally in the Caucasus. Substantial upgrading military exercises there in 2024. Beagle Partner is the name of their joint training exercise. They're working from behind, the U.S. officials admit, in Armenia, which remains a member of the Russian-led CSTO organization. There's greater issues of interoperability, even issues of language. Not many officers in Armenia speak English, for example, so it makes it very, very, very difficult. But whereas the US is moving away, Russia seems to be moving in. Some are louder than others. Dmitry Medvedev talking about arresting the president of Georgia for potentially fomenting a coup. And here are some of these other very loud figures on the Russian right, Alexander Dubin and Margaret Simonyan becoming involved in claiming Georgia as Russian land. I think what would happen potentially in the potential nearer term scenarios for Georgian Dream is they might join the so-called 3+3 group, which has Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey involved as well. So a non-Western aligned group and Russia too is seeking to look at regional cooperation that Georgia has not joined up until now. I actually noticed that Armenia was one of the countries that has recognized Georgian Dream. There's one that I was a bit more surprised about than some of the usual suspects, Azerbaijan, Hungary, that we wouldn't be surprised at. Maybe Georgian Dream might join BRICS. That would be another potential avenue. In fact, Turkey is now interested in BRICS and they're a NATO partner. There's a big question as to whether there would be some kind of movement now towards working with Russia on some kind of agreement with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the two territories controlled by Russia within Georgian territory. There's been lots of rumors about this, but nothing to agree. And then the last thing I'll mention is sort of China's interest in the region. China has been very active in Georgia now. The so-called middle corridor that's been built, it started really from EU in Ukraine into Georgia through the Black Sea, and then across the east into eventually China, bypassing Russia and Iran. The Prime Minister, Georgian Prime Minister, Irakli Darabashvili, signed a strategic partnership agreement with China, transport and telecommunications. So Georgian Dream has other options than the West. So the question is what the West threshold for action is, and as formally mentioned, with the US election coming up, this could be an issue. And I know when I was there in the summertime, a lot of discussion was a lot of the nervous Georgian Dream members who were being sanctioned potentially by the United States, by the European Union for these pro-Russian laws, were being told by Georgian Dream leadership, "Oh, just wait until Donald Trump gets elected, and we won't have to worry about it anymore because he didn't care about Georgian alignment." So let me stop there. Thank you to all of the panelists for their remarks. Now what I'd like to do is take some questions or comments from the audience. We'll take for 3 or so at a time, and then we'll go around and have some reactions. We're trying to keep it relatively brief and pose a question for us. So I'll just recognize hands Yes,
Well, I have a question about.
Sorry.
Oh, that's not a problem. So I have a question about the opposition mainly. So because the election was framed in the way that it was, I'm curious why, like, there still seems to be a fragmentation within the opposition, and we saw that with the way that the amount of votes each and every one got. So I was wondering if you guys have sort of some insight as to what that fragmentation within the opposition might mean and what it might represent within the nation, perhaps. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at those numbers, when you bring them together, they're a good chunk, but when you see them individually, it kind of is a little underwhelming, I think.
So it's biased. There were four major opposition parties, each of which got, I think the maximum was 15%.
Yeah. Around like content.
Yeah. So,
Regarding the external legitimization, how do you think the offering the candidacy to European Union provided legitimacy to the Georgian dream? And do you think that that was a step that should have been taken by the EU last year, or it practically going against what the EU is about?
maybe one more question. Okay, we'll start with.
I'm just sort of wondering about sort of Viktor Orban's sort of position. I'm pretty sure on his Twitter, he congratulated Georgia's dream quite prematurely, like before the election result for even in. Despite polling saying it would be close, and he's also gone, as has already been mentioned, to Georgia and gone on about how the results have been fair and impartial, which the EU have contradicted. I'm just sort of wondering what that says about the election, what that says about Viktor Orban and sort of his connections to Georgian Dream and Russia, and sort of what that sort of says about the future direction of sort of security and relations in Europe.
Okay, so the questions we have are the question of the fragmentation of the opposition. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
This is
Sorry, speak up, just speak up.
it's a question for Anna. She's talking about the gender relations and how with things becoming more conservative, things are shifting. I think we could also say that's potentially happening here in the West as well. And so I was just wondering, like, what is your commentary on that? What could we learn from what's already happening in Eastern Europe, perhaps, and like, I guess, improve the current situation here? And then also, I suppose, I'm curious, sorry, I'm just trying to put this question together in my head. In terms of the fact that they're saying that this is like a liberal and Western imported idea, because these similar sentiments are starting to be shared in the West, how are they able to like maintain that idea if that shift is also happening?
So, so fragmentation of opposition, external legitimization, you question about Viktor Orban, and his question about shifting gender relations in the West. And Nikita, I was just thinking that we had this election in Saskatchewan where Brad Wald was successfully reelected premier, said the first thing he was going to do was introduce gender recognition program. So it's definitely not just an issue in Georgia as well. So maybe we'll go in order of our speakers. So Cornelie, do you want to start?
Thank you. Maybe I'll try briefly answer at least two of them. First of all, about opposition. I think we have to understand that Georgian voters last 3 decades, basically, they were always choosing the saviors. First, it was first president, charismatic leader Gamsapurdia. Then it was Shevardnadze, who was Soviet diplomat. Then there was Mikhail Saakashvili. And last, they thought that, Bizina Ivanishvili, who was a tycoon and who had 7 billion, he was kind of savior. This is the first election when we don't have a saviors, which is a good news. It's one way, but the thing is that it's also creates problems because our political parties are not really party's classical sense, except maybe few like UNM who has some sort of experience being a ruling party. Most of them, they are more like electoral parties, like pretty much like in US. So they don't, sometimes they don't really represent the interest group like they should be. And there's no clear cleavages as well in terms of who they represent. And I think this also creates some sort of problem in terms of how they reach the ordinary Georgians. And if you follow, for instance, this election, and we actually had published a policy memo where we actually were pushing them to pay more attention to the regions, because according to our study, basically more than 70% of Georgian registered, like voters, they live outside of Tbilisi. But when we were talking to the opposition leaders, they were saying that, well, we cannot reach the rural areas that they already, we don't have that kind of resources, and we should concentrate in bigger cities. And they did so. But I think that this was probably a miscalculation. But another thing which where the opposition is kind of weak, that the smaller political parties, they have some some history behind of them. Most of them, except maybe Lelo and Kaharia's party, it was splinter party from Saakashvili's party. And as you know, Saakashvili is himself very divisive person. There are the people who actually, don't like him. And I think this also, this conflict between Saakashvili and Ivanishvili is something which actually drives Georgian democracy back, because what we need is, we don't need this kind of two personality-driven kind of field, but we need more like institutionalized politics. But I think that problem is also the opposition doesn't have so much resources. We should not forget that we should not be also idealistic that when you have, administrative resources, when you have, more than 300,000, like socially vulnerable people, you have majority of Georgian businesses actually, they fund the ruling party, and plus you have a tycoon who is behind of this party, which has 7.6 billion. And I think in this kind of environment, we can criticize, of course, the opposition, but it should be like miracle that you should really win, especially in this kind of circumstances. As far as the EU-Georgia, if I understood this correctly, I think my personal feeling is that it was correct decision that EU gave candidate status to Georgia, not because Georgian government deserved it, but as it was communicated, because of Georgian people. And I have some dispute about this with my friends still, even today, whether it was good the choice or not. But believe me, just imagine if EU didn't gave Georgia candidate status, then there will be talk now from Georgian Dream that basically EU pushed us away and they don't really want us to be part of European Union. So they would even more will try to strengthen their anti-Western and anti-European, the slogans. And I think in general, I think that what we see now, probably, the EU already halted Georgia's European integration. Probably Georgia may lose the visa-free regime. That's already kind of under discussion. I don't know about the candidate status, because this is an open question, because, we have some other countries like Turkey who has the candidate status for decades and nobody actually taken that away. So we don't know how that will work, because for this you need some political decision with majority. And since we have the Hungary there and Slovakia, it may not be so easy to discuss that issue. About the Orban, I think the Orban regime is a kind of role model for the Georgian government. And basically when they speak about Georgia, they want, and when they talk about this global war party, and basically what they want is they want see the international politics dominated by pretty much like right-wing parties and so-called patriots or whatever they call them. And they want Europe, which will be dominated by this kind of parties and not by liberals as such. And I think this is and also they want and they wish to see Donald Trump as the president of the United States, because they believe that, he may have a deal with Russia. He may not care about so much promotion of global democracy globally. And he doesn't know also Georgia. He doesn't have a links to Georgia as such. But what they believe with miscalculating that even if that kind of scenario, even if Trump will come to the power, I think he still has US still has a national interest in the region, especially toward China, which United States sees pretty much like systemic rival. So I think that's not really good news for Georgian Dream. And anyway, we don't know what will be the outcome of this election. I think as far as the Orban visit, I think this was probably planned, as many observers claim, because Georgian Dream knew that they will have this kind of crisis of the legitimacy here, and I think that this was probably orchestrated with him, that he should come here and he should congratulate the government. But I think in general, we know that what the Orbanist brings, he's not the most principled person in European politics. He was actually a very close friend of previous president Mikhail Saakashvili. He even visited several times. So he doesn't have a permanent friends. He just has, some allies temporarily and according to his needs. And he also not a big supporter of Georgians as such, or Georgian democracy. He uses or misuses Georgia or other countries pretty much for his own, political purposes. Maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
David, and also if you want to bring in a bit of talk about the election regularity.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think I will touch upon about the political party issue as well, and expand on the irregularities issue. So with regard to political parties, I think so. There were discussions. What should political parties do for these elections? One way to go was just having a unified list of all candidates, basically bringing together all major oppositional political parties to go against the Georgian Dream. And we mentioned Hungary, and I think that was what Hungarian opposition did in 2022, I think. So basically, you could have everybody in that oppositional list in the Hungarian elections, including Jobbik, who is like far right to the political parties that were like center and center left and left liberal, but it didn't work because of different issues. But even in the proportional representation in Hungary, this was not a good idea. So therefore, the opposition decided to go to the Polish way, because in Poland, an election that saw the party of Prawo and Sprawiedliwość was ousted from the government, actually saw three major political coalitions. So it was the Civic Platform, it was and two other, like the left-wing party, Lewica, and also like towards kind of center liberal political group in Poland 2025. So, and this configuration was very successful in this situation. So the low end, the Civic Platform formed the government, but in a coalition with the other two political parties. And I think that was the rationale for the Georgian opposition political parties to also form such kind of three major coalitions. And also, I mean, if we look at the political parties, there are still kind of some subtle differences in terms of ideology. The voters perhaps are not that ideological. It is a problem in all the political, kind of all the electorate of, let's say, if you go eastwards from Europe. But they certainly offered some different political platforms. Like I would say, like at least one major political coalition was like fiscally conservative but socially liberal. Another political party was towards the center in terms of the economic approach. Another opposition coalition was towards left, but they were kind of leaning towards kind of more socially liberal policies. While the Georgian Dream kind of firmly stood on the economically left, but also socially very conservative platform. So I think in that regard, perhaps the opposition's approach and of forming 3 or 4 major coalitions was a right gamble. But this brings us to the election, how well elections actually represent the votes of the wishes of Georgians. First of all, that we need to consider is that not all votes were rigged, that's for sure. But these incremental gains here and there, using multiple ways of affecting elections, actually works really well. In some places, that could be so-called block voting. Let's say in rural areas, you as a political party try to negotiate with local elites, or you actually have somebody on the payroll that are bribing voters to vote for a political party. That's one approach. Right now, a big discussion point is about how people were voting. That is, Georgia introduced voting machines. So you have a paper ballot on which you just kind of mark your choice. You bring that to the voting machine, and you slip that ballot inside the machine, and it scans and it gives you information. It was about, I think, 2,500 out of 3,000 precincts did that, and the majority of voters voted with machines. But the challenge was that, as opposition and election watchdogs are alleging, that these violated the secrecy of voting. So if you were careful enough, and political parties did have representatives at polling stations, you could actually see for whom a particular person voted for. The location of the Georgian dream on this ballot list is at the very end of the list. So you can, when you slip this your ballot in the machine, you can actually see if a person voted or not for the government. So it was, NGOs and political parties are alleging that this was the way of controlling the will of the people. So if you have somebody on the polling station you can actually kind of count, and you can actually check to that person whether the person voted for you or not. I mean, these are like too much smoke going on right now, because it's still like very fresh, and we don't really know how widespread that kind of control was. But still, if there are questions, I think those questions need to be answered.
I will just add a couple of things about political parties and EU as well. I think everything that was said is true, that they have been fragmented, they didn't have resources, this institutional architecture in the regions, network, they were weak from that perspective, and that they were not able to form this one united list. So I think it's understandable that there's been mistrust, even up till like yesterday or 2 days ago. Would they stand together? Would none of them actually agree to be part of this parliament? And I think this rally that was called by the president 2 days after the election, where everybody were together, that everybody said that nobody's going into this parliament, we stand united. That was an attempt to mitigate those fears, which were well-founded given the history of these parties before. So let's see what happens next. They say they work together in coordination with the president. So, I mean, we have to look for next week to what happens in terms of that unity. For the EU candidate, I think it's useful, I think, to think about the elections as a culmination of the process, which I would call probably an active resistance, probably that started with the first time introduction of the foreign agents law. And candidacy was given during this period of after this big wave of protests. And it was even stated, I think, that this was given to Georgian people who aspired to be part of Europe. I would also recall that there were foreign ministers of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, I think, who actually visited one of those opposition rallies, speaking of legitimizing this whole process. And lastly, there was a statement by European Union about the elections now, where they say that the way these elections were conducting do not align with the standards of the country that has candidate status. So in some way, this gives more weight, I think, to this statement, more urgency. Yeah, so that's, I guess, what I want to say. Thanks.
Anna?
Hi again. I think I'll address the question given to me. And that was about what the West can learn from Eastern Europe, and how is the Eastern Europe, or how are the spaces able to maintain the idea that West is imposing liberal ideologies when the West has messed up itself. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that it's really hard to say that this kind of shift to the right wing and authoritarian regimes happen in the Eastern Europe or anywhere in the East, because it has happened or global South, really. It has happened in many places, and then it's also happening in the West. I think the direction of this discourse is moving back and forth is not that linear. In fact, if we look at the anti-gender discourse specifically, at least the arguments that the right wing political or social groups have utilized later actually originate in Catholic Church in the 90s, when it was starting to oppose gender equity imposed by supported by the UN, really. That's where the anti-gender discourse as we know it today comes from. And then you have kind of like Russia's political ideologists working on this, like the kind of sort of loosely called new traditionalism. And then this discourse has started to align with each other. So it's really hard. Like, we can do this kind of historical investigation. That's my topic. That's why I'm interested in it. But essentially what we can see is that we can't really say that West can really learn anything in the Eastern Europe because it started in Eastern Europe. Really, what we can look at maybe is what happens when this kind of ideas that are floating around us get institutionalized on the level of the government. So in that, we can look at the example of Hungary, for example, because it's been 15 years that Orban's been in power. But we can also look at the US elections when the Trump maybe is going to get elected for the second round. So it's also, the question is also what the West can learn from itself, and what the West can learn from, like, how it's been doing this sort of like social justice or democratic work inside and outside that has resulted in so much resistance towards it, right? And so, like, a general comment. The other thing of like how the different authoritarian regimes are able to maintain the idea that liberal or democratic ideas are Western imposition, it really depends on when we're talking, where we're talking about. For example, in Russian traditionalist discourse, it's the West that's imposing whatever they're opposing, because they're kind of trying to establish themselves as an alternative civilization to the West, right? This kind of Russian world, Slavic world kind of a thing. Whereas in Hungary is interesting. So Hungary had, like, Hungarian right-wing discourse had this kind of like two Europes as like constructed threats. And I feel like Georgian government's trying to do that too. So there is this good old white Europe, which is also straight and traditional. And Hungary almost like felt itself as this gatekeeper of this kind of like real Europeanness. That the second Europe, which is the EU and the Brussels, that is taking away from Europe itself, right? And I feel like Georgia is trying to do the same thing by like bringing in Orban as Europe's representative, like it like depicts this alternative, like not perverted Europe. But essentially, like really, like the authoritarian, nationalist, right-wing regimes always need to construct a threat, and they will construct a threat whatever works strategically for them. Is like, in short, to answer your question. I hope this helps. If there is anything else that I could clarify, I'd be happy to.
Great. I do have a couple of questions online, so I'm going to yield my time. And if there's one or two questions for last, before we move to the online questions?
Maybe a bit of a provocative question, but do you think that the West has anything to learn from Russia in terms of soft power? Given that we talked about how Hungary and Georgia both have a sort of history of anti-Russian, like they were both invaded in 1956, 2008, and yet we sort of saw a geopolitical realignment in Hungary. We see the Georgian Dream talk about the war party, how when DC are to blame the war in Ukraine. And so that's sort of astonishing. Do you think that the West can sort of look at what has happened and apply some of those lessons in maybe areas that are traditionally anti-Western and the global South? Or do you think that this is a genuine development that was led by figures in Hungary and in Georgia that sort of chose to realign themselves with, and that this isn't actually the result of any Russian policy?
Or as Slovakia?
Oh yeah, Slovakia.
Thomas, next.
Regarding the recent EU protests in Georgia, regarding the most recent EU protests in Georgia and how recent election is still results are being debated, do you feel like a potential Euromaidan situation in Georgia?
Well, I was gonna ask that regarding the recent protests and demonstrations. How might this political instability in Georgia affect the protests?
And then the questions I have online, there are two related questions about the perception of Russia. So the effect of the 2008 war, how that played in to this question of Georgian Dream, the fact that Saakashvili was in power during that war, and then this question too about the Russian relocancy in Georgian Dream broader policy towards not just Russia but Russian presence in the Caucasus. So we've got 12 minutes. So maybe if each of you can maybe take one question for a couple of minutes and focus on that, we'll try and get through. So quarterly.
Okay, I didn't hear, actually, I cannot hear you well, but at least I understood probably one question about the Russia and something like about Russia, but didn't hear exactly what. If Russia if past relations with Russia played some important role with Hungary and Georgia, right? That was the question.
Yeah, I think the question about whether the West can take some lessons from Russia's apparent success in Hungary, Slovakia, Georgia. If this is a question of like Russian success or if it's an internal dynamic.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. I think, to say frankly, West made a huge mistake like last decades because it was considered, especially considering the relations with the South Caucasus and Georgia. Basically, after George Bush administration, starting from Obama administration, U.S. strategic interest declined toward Georgia, and it was visible for many years already. U.S. started the reset policy, we all remember, with Russia, and then also European Union and Germany even started some, rapprochement, the strategic relations with Russia. And then it was considered that it was taken as a granted that Georgia is kind of pro-Western country, who is kind of permanent laboratory of change, of democracy, and it will stay like this. But interestingly, we have talked recently, a few weeks ago, with the supporters of Georgian Dream, who support the Georgian Dream. And basically, we asked them why what are the reasons basically they supporting this party, and why they have this kind of why they actually share their anti-Western sentiment. I talked about lots of things, but I will just share 2 points, which was kind of important and which can be, closer to the topic of discussion. First, Georgians who support Georgian Dream, they said that actually last 30 years, West didn't manage to secure the security of Georgia. As you mentioned already, Georgia was promised together with Ukraine that one day it will become member of NATO, which was never materialized. And Georgia, as it was mentioned, like played quite important and active role in NATO operations in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but it didn't really paid off at the end of the day. And plus, you have the security dilemma, especially after Russian invasion of Ukraine, of Georgia, and then Ukraine. The Georgians realized that if Russia invades second time Georgia, there's nobody actually who can help it. And as it was mentioned many times, Georgia doesn't have a strategic depth like Ukraine has. And, we have a small country, and it's unlikely that, we can defend ourselves alone. And I think that's the issue which was not really properly addressed, according to these people, by the West. And second, more important issue, which they mentioned, this is that West could not manage to bring an economic model, a kind of sustainable economic model for Georgia. So basically, Georgia was seen kind of like the developing country. There was a lot of help, everything, but it was not like there was no really direct investment or some sort of projects which would bring this Western capital there. So I think that they felt like that Georgia is dealt pretty much like kind of periphery of the West, and they ordinary Georgians, they didn't really felt that this kind of reforms or all this economical policy, they didn't bring anything for ordinary Georgians, and that's why they have this kind of grievances which you have there. And of course, we can discuss why West could not do it. First of all, there's so much, things the West can do and West cannot solve, including EU and the United States, everything, because, they have to also pay attention to other global issues, including the Middle East, China, some other countries. But at the same time, you have, and this is a good good opportunity for Russia and some illiberal powers like China to step in, because and basically to offer some sort of alternative model of the development. And this is where at least GD is trying to monopolize. Of course, they use it for their own populist reasons, but there's some local reasons there as well. It's not like you cannot say just then blame everything on Russia. There's some truth that there's a Russian influence. Russia tries to manipulate, but of course you have some local, grievances which is used by Russia as such. I'll stop here.
Maybe David, like 2 minutes.
I would just quickly discuss about the regional dynamics about the South Caucasus. Actually, it is really interesting that we have quite credible reports from independent media in Azerbaijan, that speaks about how the ruling government of Azerbaijan was actually trying to support the Georgian dream. So they had a very positive coverage in Azerbaijan state-run media, and this includes all media that is affiliated with different branches, like ASMO, like Ministry of Defense, or like the presidential administration, and multiple. Actually, there was a big. There was also an observer mission from Azerbaijan that actually said that elections were run really successfully, and I think that was the first time, at least it's the first one that I can recall, that the Azerbaijan government was so vocal about elections in Georgia. In other times, I can't recall that. With regard to Armenia, I think in Armenia, things were a little bit different. The Prime Minister Kovakadze, he actually met 2 weeks ago with Nikol Pashinyan. I'm not sure what was the topic of discussion, but that was quite not incidental, I would say, that the two leaders met, and they might have been some discussion. But I think that was, speaking about foreign interference, I think that was a very, very interesting dynamic, and it was the first time that we can openly see such thing happening in Georgian elections.
I can very quickly about a question about potential Euromaidan. I don't know. I would just say that that a day ago, there was a statement by one of the opposition leaders that they consider two milestones as a next step. So one is when the election commission officially announces the results. And the second is when this parliament gets together for its first session. So I think if we want to look specifically on events, especially what's happening outside on the street, we need to pay attention to the states.
Anna?
Hi, maybe I can talk about like the soft power aspect of Russia. Am I muted?
No, I'm just saying 2 minutes. If we're...
Okay, soft power aspect of Russia. There are two things here that I think we need to consider, like basically like almost like think about like what is the cause of this resistance towards, I don't know, pretty much democracy and equity recently, right? And I'm not sure I would learn anything from Russia because what Russia has done is like a very strategic kind of like online and offline discursive and ideological work of organizing groups, of organizing discourses, crafting the discourses, infiltrating the public discourse with the specific arguments and spreading them, funding various right-wing groups everywhere. And this is the kind of like methods that I'm not sure. It's good to know about them and to figure out the ways to resist them, but I'm not sure those are most, say, conscientious methods to be learned or taken up. On the other hand, the bigger question I really think is like to think about how in the current day, Western neoliberal democracies have disheartened people. Like, what are the reasons why this kind of traditionalist rhetorics and politics get taken up and popular so easily, right? And part of it is kind of disorientation and a lot of spread of misinformation. But there are some actual, like why Russian politics was so successful is that it would take actual issues and kind of turn them around. It's always half true. So a lot of critique of the West is almost often truth. Then the kind of the ideology that's built upon that for us to resist, say, Western economic dominance, we need to become fascist and right-wing. That link is a little problematic, but the critiques are often acute. Okay, so I think it's good to disentangle them and see again where the West itself can take responsibility in what is happening inside of it and outside. It's very vague, but like I think that's the best I can do in like 2 minutes.
I'll just add one sentence to Moss's question. I mentioned this 3+3 format: Russia, Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, that Russia proposed in 2020. When Georgia has not gone to this format yet, they may go. This may be some of the discussions that were had. And it's a question of a broader piece that would include Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Georgia may play a role. Maybe it's easier to think if the West is out of it in Europe. I'm not sure. We'll see. But anyway, let's end on Canada. I know we have another class coming in. It's a wonderful presentation. Now that we're about to thanks to all our speakers and thanks to our audience, and keep tuned for our next event with Eastern European Transatlantic Network. And thank you to the Department of National Defense.